You're not even half the man my father is." The words cut through the air like a blade, and Thomas froze as his daughter-in-law, Vanessa's smug voice echoed across the dinner table. His own son Michael kept his eyes down, silent, complicit, while the woman he had welcomed into his family stripped him of his dignity in front of everyone. Thomas's hand gripped the chair, the humiliation burning deeper than any wound. Yet, he pushed back slowly, his face unreadable. The silence was heavier than any argument, and behind his calm eyes a storm was already forming. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. What comes next will leave you breathless. Thomas sat frozen, his breath caught halfway in his chest as if the room itself had turned to stone. Vanessa's words hadn't been loud, but they carried the kind of venom that spreads fast, poisoning every corner of a man's pride. For a moment he thought perhaps he'd misheard her, that the clink of wine glasses or the hum of conversation had distorted the truth. But no, her smirk, that deliberate tilt of her head, confirmed every syllable. "You're not even half the man my father is." It was not just a comment. It was a verdict, one passed down without appeal, without mercy, and it echoed louder in Thomas's ears than any gavel could. He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. The laughter at the table stumbled, then faded into silence. Every eye shifted in his direction, searching his face for a crack, for a reaction, for some evidence that the mighty had indeed fallen. His own son Michael avoided his gaze, his jaw tight, his hand wrapped around his wineglass as if it were a lifeline. No words of defense, no hand on his father's shoulder. Just silence, cold, unforgiving silence that screamed louder than Vanessa's insult. Thomas's pulse hammered against his temples. It wasn't just the insult. It was the realization that somewhere along the way, the man who had built this family with sweat and sacrifice had been quietly erased. He was no longer the anchor of the household, but an inconvenience, a relic taking up space in the background of their perfect little lives. The sting of betrayal dug deeper than the shame. He felt it coil inside his chest, an old familiar ache he thought had been buried with Caroline, his late wife, years ago. Now it was back, alive and vicious, fueled by the faces staring at him as though he were a stranger trespassing at his own table. The fork in his hand trembled, clattering against the plate. He stared down at the half-carved roast beef, its juices pooling red on the porcelain, and it suddenly looked grotesque, like some sacrifice laid before wolves. He tightened his grip, knuckles whitening, forcing the tremor to still. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, her eyes glittering with cruel amusement. She had delivered her strike with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to aim. Every second of silence that followed only cemented her victory. Michael's stillness beside her made the wound worse. His refusal to stand against her meant his quiet allegiance was already cast. Thomas felt the weight of his son's betrayal press harder than the insult itself. The air thickened. He could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each second slashing through the silence like a blade. His heart pounded, his lungs struggled, but his face remained carved from stone. Inside, though, the ground was splitting. He wanted to demand an apology, to remind them whose hands had paid the mortgage, whose back had bent under decades of work, whose sacrifices had paved every brick in the path that brought them here. Yet his voice betrayed him. Nothing came. He sat locked in paralysis, the words a storm inside his head, but a void on his lips. It struck him then how cruel time could be. Only years ago, this same son had looked at him with admiration, had asked for guidance, had followed him around the workshop with eager eyes. And now here he was, shrinking under the shadow of his wife's disdain, too timid or too complicit to raise a word in defense. That transformation, that loss, hit Thomas harder than the insult. It was as if he were mourning Michael even while he sat across from him, alive but no longer his. A bead of sweat traced down his temple. He shifted slightly, the chair creaking beneath him, the sound breaking the spell of silence, if only for an instant. The others resumed their whispers, cautious, uncertain. But Thomas caught the look Vanessa gave Michael, the small victorious curl of her lips, as if she had tamed not just a son, but his father as well. Thomas felt the walls close in. The glow of the chandelier overhead seemed too bright, throwing sharp shadows across the table, that twisted their faces into caricatures of cruelty. The wine in his glass tasted sour metallic. He set it down and pushed his plate away, appetite replaced by a bitter taste that refused to leave. His chest rose and fell shallow, each breath heavier than the last. He wanted to leave to escape the suffocating theater that had once been his home. But he stayed still because walking away too soon would feel like surrender. So he sat silent, his eyes drifting between the people he once called family. In that moment he realized what hurt most was not the words themselves but the truth hidden behind them. Somewhere, somehow, he had lost control of the narrative of his own life. They no longer saw him as the man who had carried them, but as an outdated figure easy to dismiss with a single cruel sentence. The thought sliced deeper than Vanessa's insult. He had allowed this. By yielding, by staying quiet too often, by giving without demanding respect, he had opened the door for them to strip him bare. The realization brought with it a slow, simmering fire. It started in his chest, spreading through his veins, steadying his breath. The paralysis began to fade, replaced by something colder, sharper. He wasn't done. Not yet. Thomas leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing, his expression unreadable. The insult still burned, but beneath it a new resolve took root. He would not rise to their bait tonight, would not give them the spectacle they wanted. He would bide his time, let them believe they had broken him. That belief would be their greatest mistake. The grandfather clock struck again, the sound reverberating through the dining room. Thomas let the echo settle inside him like a drumbeat, a reminder that patience was as powerful a weapon as rage. Vanessa might think she had won, but she had only awakened a man who knew how to build and how to dismantle. The dinner resumed with forced chatterglasses, clinking laughter, trying to patch the rift. But Thomas sat in silence, his mind already crafting something far more dangerous than any outburst could be. A plan was forming, subtle and precise, and when it unfolded, every smug glance, every dismissive silence would come crashing down on them like a hammer. As he rose from his chair, his movements calm, deliberate, he caught Michael's eye for the briefest moment. There was a flicker there, uncertainty, maybe even guilt, but it was buried quickly under obedience to his wife's gaze. Thomas turned away, his footsteps steady echoing across the hardwood floor. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence carried more weight than words, and in that silence a promise was born. No one at that table knew what was coming. But they would. And when it came, they would never forget the night they mistook his stillness for defeat. Michael's eyes dropped to the tablecloth, his face turned just enough to avoid his father's gaze. That single gesture was sharper than any blade, a quiet surrender that spoke louder than words. Thomas felt it like a blow to the chest, heavier than Vanessa's insult, heavier than all the scorn that had already been poured on him. His own son's silence, the son he had carried on his shoulders through summer fairs, the boy he had taught to fish at dawn, the young man he had cheered for on high school bleachers, now sat across from him, shoulders squared but spine bent, unwilling to meet his father's eyes. It was not shyness. It was allegiance to her, to the woman who had just carved his father's dignity into pieces. The betrayal was quiet but absolute. The room dimmed in Thomas's mind, voices blurred, the golden light from the chandelier hazed into a cold glare. He watched Michael's fingers trace the rim of his glass, a restless rhythm betraying his nerves, yet he said nothing. Not one word. Not one attempt at defense. The weight of that silence pressed on Thomas like iron chains. Years of sacrifice, every double shift, every late-night drive to pick him up from practice. Every dollar saved for tuition gone in an instant, dissolved into the cowardice of a lowered gaze. The silence stretched, and Thomas's breath came shallow, steady, as if each inhale was measured against the fury building inside him. He remembered the time Michael had fallen off his bike, knees scraped and bleeding, how he had cried until Thomas scooped him up and promised he would always be there. And he had kept that promise. Through every failure, through every triumph, through heartbreaks and debts, Thomas had been the constant. Yet tonight, when loyalty mattered most, his son's voice was nowhere. The memory soured into bitterness. Promises, it seemed, were not inherited. Vanessa leaned closer to Michael, her hand brushing his arm, staking her claim with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. She knew the silence meant victory, and the smirk she wore was a brand seared into Thomas's heart. Michael didn't flinch. He allowed her hand to linger, allowed her triumph to stand uncontested, and in doing so, he chose her side with every heartbeat. Thomas stared at his son, waiting, hoping for a flicker of resistance, for even a hint that the man he raised still lived beneath that lowered head. But there was nothing. Only the soft clink of glass, the murmurs of other guests filling the void, pretending not to notice the fracture running straight through the center of the family. Inside, Thomas felt the ground shift. The loneliness came swift, fierce, not the quiet solitude of a widower's evening, but the cold abandonment of being erased while still alive. He sat among them, but might as well have been invisible, a ghost at his own table. The ache crawled into his chest, spreading until it weighed on every part of him. And yet beneath the ache, something else stirred, a clarity brutal and sharp. For the first time, Thomas saw his son not as a boy to protect, but as a man who had failed him, who had stood idle while another stripped his father bare. That recognition carved away the last remnants of illusion. The bond he thought unbreakable had been tested, and it had snapped clean. He lifted his glass, the crystal catching the light, and drank slowly, never looking away from Michael. The wine was bitter metallic, but it steadied his hand, masked the storm in his eyes. He placed the glass down with deliberate care, the sound a quiet punctuation to the silence his son had chosen. The conversation around the table resumed in fragments, strained, brittle, but Thomas heard none of it. He saw only Michael, the boy who once swore he wanted to be like his father, now bent beneath another's will, too weak or too willing to speak. The shame of it burned hotter than any insult. Thomas leaned back his chair, creaking under the weight of his stillness. He let the moment etch itself into memory, every detail, every gesture, every flicker of expression. He would not forget this. More importantly, neither would they. His gaze shifted from Michael to Vanessa, and though he said nothing, the silence carried a promise darker than words could hold. He let the pause linger, let it stretch until the air itself felt taut. Then finally he stood calm and deliberate, leaving behind a silence heavier than anger. No one moved to stop him, not Michael, not anyone. And that absence was the final seal on the betrayal. As he walked from the table, his footsteps steady, Thomas knew one truth burned into his bones. The debt of this silence would be paid, and when it was, it would shake them all to their core. The dinner table, once a place of comfort and familiarity, had become a cage of suffocating tension. The aroma of roasted chicken and seasoned potatoes hung thick in the air, but what should have been warm and inviting now clung to Thomas's throat like smoke. He shifted in his seat, the scrape of the chair legs against hardwood louder than it should have been, and every sound felt magnified in the silence that pressed down on the room. The steam rising from the dishes curled upward, carrying with it the taste of humiliation. Food that had once been lovingly prepared, a symbol of family gathering, now seemed poisoned by betrayal. He could not bring himself to swallow. Each bite would taste of scorn. Thomas looked at the spread across the table, the polished silverware, the bowls of vegetables, the fresh rolls stacked high in a basket. He remembered countless nights when he had carved meat at this very spot, his son at his side, eager to take the first slice. Those memories felt distant now, stripped of warmth, as though they belonged to someone else's life. The laughter that should have filled the room had been replaced by the hollow clink of utensils and the deliberate avoidance of eyes. Every glance slid away from him, as though he were the shadow at the edge of their gathering, not the man who had built it. Shame seeped into his skin, hot and relentless. It wasn't just Vanessa's words or Michael's silence. It was the realization that the very heart of his home had been taken from him. The table that once represented unity and care was now a stage for his humiliation. He felt small, diminished, stripped of authority, and the weight of that degradation pressed on his shoulders heavier than any labor he had ever endured. The walls seemed to lean closer, the golden glow of the chandelier above mocking in its brightness, spotlighting his downfall. He forced his gaze downward, staring at his untouched plate. The roast, once juicy and inviting, had cooled, the fat congealing along the edges. The vegetables glistened with butter, but their sheen only reflected the falseness of the moment. Each dish was a reminder of what he no longer had: a family bound by love, respect, or even the courtesy of acknowledgement. His appetite was gone, hollowed out by the weight of their disregard. Around him, voices tried to restart. Vanessa's laugh rang out, brittle and sharp, cutting through the room like glass. Michael muttered a few words low, barely audible, his tone forced. The others chimed in with half-hearted remarks about the wine, the weather, the trivialities that filled silence when truth was too dangerous. Every word scraped at Thomas's nerves. He could hear the falseness, the desperate attempt to plaster over the fracture that split the room in two. He was on one side alone. They were on the other, complicit in their indifference. The air was heavy, the kind that weighed on lungs and made every breath an effort. Thomas lifted his glass, watching the liquid ripple, the deep red catching the light like spilled blood. He brought it to his lips, but the bitterness only deepened the taste of defeat. He set it down carefully, the faint thud against the wood louder than any voice. Across the table, Vanessa's eyes lingered on him, a spark of triumph dancing there, as though his silence was proof of her victory. Humiliation burned hotter. Thomas could feel it in his ears, in the flush creeping along his neck. He wanted to leave to escape the stifling atmosphere, but pride rooted him in place. Walking away now would be surrender, and he refused to give them that. So he endured each second of battle, each moment an act of restraint. The ticking of the clock in the hallway grew louder, its rhythm a reminder that time was moving, dragging him through this gauntlet of shame. He wondered if anyone else could hear it, or if it was only pounding in his head, a metronome for his humiliation. The candle flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls, mocking him with their restless movement. The weight of the moment carved itself into him, searing into memory. He would not forget the suffocating smell of food gone bitter with contempt, the shallow laughter filling the void, the silence of his son as damning as a verdict. Every detail was a scar being etched in real time, a reminder of where loyalty had died. Yet beneath the crushing shame, a quiet strength began to stir. He did not rise. He did not speak. But the stillness he maintained was not weakness. It was patience. The kind of patience that builds in silence until it becomes something sharper, something unbreakable. He let his gaze lift slow and deliberate, scanning the faces around the table. Not one pair of eyes met his. They all knew what had been done, what had been said, and yet no one had intervened. Their cowardice bound them together as tightly as Vanessa's cruelty. That realization hardened something inside him. The atmosphere of the table no longer felt like a burden, but like a ledger being written in real time, every act of silence a debt to be repaid. Thomas knew this meal, this night, would not be forgotten, not by him, and when the time came, not by them either. He straightened slightly, his back rigid, his expression calm but unreadable. Let them laugh. Let them eat. Let them believe he had been broken in silence. They had mistaken shame for surrender before, and they would pay dearly for that mistake. The food lay untouched before him, forgotten, congealed. The air pressed heavy, but Thomas breathed it in steady and controlled. Each inhale was a promise. Each exhale a warning. No one at that table noticed the storm he carried in his stillness. They would soon enough. And when they did, the weight of this night would come crashing back on them with a force they never imagined. The sounds at the table blurred until they were nothing more than distant echoes, muffled like voices heard through thick glass. Thomas's eyes locked on the plates, the flicker of candlelight, the polished silver that no longer reflected warmth, but something hollow. And in that haze his mind betrayed him, pulling him backward into the glow of evenings long gone. He saw the same table, but draped in laughter. He saw Michael as a boy, cheeks flushed with excitement, begging to tell a joke that never landed, yet still drew roars of laughter because Thomas would clap his hands, slap the table, and laugh louder than anyone. just to make his son feel proud. He saw Caroline, his late wife, passing the breadbasket with that smile that had anchored their home, a smile that made the simplest meal feel like a celebration. He could almost hear the radio playing faintly in the kitchen, the smell of apple pie drifting from the oven, and the hum of belonging that wrapped around them like a blanket. The memory came so vividly it felt cruel. To see his family alive in that warmth, to hear the laughter, to feel the easy rhythm of love, only to open his eyes and face this, the silence, the cutting words, the emptiness that now sat in their place. The contrast hit like a second death. He had already lost Caroline. Her absence haunted him in every corner of the house. But tonight, watching his son sit silent beside a woman who wielded cruelty like a weapon, Thomas felt the loss all over again. It was as if his family had been ripped from him twice, once by fate and now by choice. The ache grew sharper as memory collided with reality. He remembered teaching Michael to carve the turkey on Thanksgiving, his small hands awkward around the knife, Thomas's larger hands guiding his grip. He remembered the Christmas when they stayed up late to build a bicycle together, Michael sneaking out of bed too excited to wait for morning. Those moments had been sacred proof that the sacrifices meant something, and now the boy who had once looked at him with awe sat only a few feet away, eyes cast down, loyalty surrendered. The contrast burned. The table that once carried the weight of shared stories now carried only silence and shame. Each glance around the room confirmed it. There was no trace of the family he remembered. Vanessa's smirk replaced Caroline's smile. The clink of utensils replaced laughter. The glow of candles now illuminated strangers who had once been his own flesh and blood. The bitterness of it all settled in his chest, heavy and suffocating like soil being shoveled onto a grave. Thomas gripped the edge of the table, his fingers tightening until the veins rose beneath his skin. He wanted to hold on to those memories, to pull them into the present, to remind himself that love had once lived here. But the more he clung to them, the further away they felt, dissolving like mist against the harsh light of betrayal. The realization was merciless. He was mourning again not just Caroline, but the family he thought he still had. The voices around him sharpened, suddenly pulling him from his reverie. Vanessa was laughing at something trivial, her tone dripping with superiority. Michael muttered in agreement, his voice low, submissive. The sound cut Thomas to the core. How easily his son had bent, how quickly he had forgotten. It made the memories hurt worse, like salt in a wound. Those nights of shared joy, of guiding hands and warm smiles, were reduced to nothing more than shadows. He had lost them, and worse, he had lost them to people who didn't deserve them. His eyes wandered to the empty chair at the far end of the table. For a split second he saw Caroline there, her hand folded neatly on the linen, her head tilted in quiet amusement. She would have never allowed this. She would have defended him with words sharp enough to silence Vanessa with a strength Michael would never have dared defy. The ghost of her presence filled him with both comfort and torment. Comfort because she reminded him of what was once real torment, because she was gone and he was left alone to endure this humiliation. The weight of the past pressed against him until he could barely breathe. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the images of better days wash over him one last time, a cruel slideshow of what was lost. When he opened them, the warmth was gone, replaced by cold stares and forced laughter. The room felt foreign, like stepping into a house that looked like his but belonged to strangers. He was an outsider in the very life he had built. For a fleeting moment, despair threatened to crush him, to pull him into resignation. But beneath it all, something else sparked, small but dangerous. The memories weren't just painful reminders of loss. They were proof of who he had been, of the strength and dignity he once commanded. And though they sat here now mocking him, dismissing him, they could not take that from him. They could not erase the man who had built everything they now took for granted. The contrast between past and present carved a new edge into his resolve. He would not be the ghost at this table forever. He would not sit quietly while the legacy he had forged was twisted into something unrecognizable. They thought tonight had broken him, but they were wrong. All they had done was awaken a part of him. They had underestimated the part that remembered not only what was lost, but what could still be taken back. The memories faded into the background, but their echo remained, fueling him, steadying him. He straightened slightly, his gaze cold, calculating. The room carried on around him, oblivious, convinced his silence was surrender. But deep inside, the contrast between the warmth of yesterday and the bitterness of tonight became a blade honed to perfection. He would mourn later when the house was dark and quiet. But here now he was already laying the groundwork for what was to come. They would not see it yet, but soon, very soon, the same table that had become his grave would become their reckoning. Vanessa straightened her back like a queen settling into her throne, the faint clink of her bracelet against the stem of her wineglass, deliberate, theatrical. Her chin lifted just enough to signal triumph, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. The insult she had already dealt still lingered in the air, but now she doubled down, her very posture a declaration. She didn't need to say more. The silence she commanded told the story. Thomas watched her, his jaw locked, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. He had faced foremen who screamed in his face, storms that tore through half-built homes, losses that gutted him to his core, but never had he faced arrogance this venomous, this calculated, right in his own house. Her voice broke the brittle quiet, laced with the kind of mockery meant to sting. We all have our place, don't we? Some people know when to step aside. She didn't look at him when she said it. She didn't have to. Every word was aimed squarely at Thomas, but her eyes stayed locked on Michael, daring him to challenge her, reminding him who held the reins now. Michael said nothing. His silence gave her more power, and she knew it. The smirk she offered him was the reward of an obedient soldier. The others at the table shifted uneasily, their glances darting between Vanessa and Thomas, like spectators at a fight where one man had been tied down before the first punch. No one dared intervene. The weight of Vanessa's confidence pinned them in place. She was young, she was clever, and she had learned the art of control quickly. By diminishing Thomas, she elevated herself, rewriting the family's hierarchy right before their eyes. For Thomas, the humiliation pressed deeper, but beneath it burned something colder. He saw her clearly now, stripped of all pretense. She wasn't just cruel, she was ambitious. Every tilt of her head, every carefully chosen word screamed of a woman who wanted more than respect. She wanted dominance. And the man who should have stopped her, his son, sat powerless beside her, his silence complicit. The sight twisted something in Thomas's gut. Vanessa's superiority was not earned through sacrifice or love or labor. It was stolen, built on arrogance and manipulation. She had never lifted a hammer, never carried the weight of responsibility, never known the ache of bending until your back threatened to break for the sake of your child. And yet here she sat, looking at him, like he was disposable. Like the years he had spent building a life for them all were nothing more than dust beneath her heels. Her words rang again, softer this time, but cutting. This family is moving forward. The past needs to stay where it belongs. She finally turned her gaze toward him, her eyes gleaming with challenge. It was no longer about the insult, it was about erasure. She wanted him to know, to see that in her eyes he no longer mattered. He was history. The injustice of it sparked fury in the hearts of anyone who would have been watching. The sheer audacity of a daughter-in-law declaring war on the man who had paved every stone of the path she now walked with such arrogance. But Thomas remained still. Stillness was his shield. He refused to let her see the rage clawing at his insides. Inside, however, every detail burned into him. The way she leaned back, claiming space that wasn't hers. The way she let her laugh linger too long, as if daring him to rise. The way Michael's hand rested close to hers on the table, loyal and silent. Thomas felt the betrayal sear into his bones, but along with it came clarity. This wasn't just insolence. This was strategy. She wanted to dismantle him in front of everyone so that when he finally broke, no one would remember him as a patriarch, only as a defeated old man who had outlived his usefulness. He studied her in silence, memorizing her tactics. Every smirk, every gesture, every flicker of triumph was another line in the ledger he was already writing in his mind. And in that ledger, debts would be collected. Vanessa lifted her glass again, savoring her victory sip, tilting it toward Michael in a mock toast. "To the future," she said lightly, her tone dripping with possession, her eyes glinting with cruelty. The words echoed like a verdict, dismissing him, sentencing him to irrelevance. Thomas didn't move. His hands rested steady on the table, his face calm, unreadable. But inside the fire, sharpened into resolve. She believed she had written him off, but she had only set the stage for something she could never control. He would not argue tonight. He would not defend himself in front of them. His silence was not defeat. It was the gathering of a storm. The meal dragged on every moment, stretched by the weight of Vanessa's arrogance. She held court at the table as if she were already queen and no one challenged her. Thomas's humiliation deepened, but so did his certainty. They thought they were burying him beneath shame. What they didn't see was that he was already digging their graves with it. And when the night finally ended, when the plates were cleared and the candles guttered low, Vanessa would believe she had won, but she hadn't. She had only awakened a man who had spent his life building foundations strong enough to outlast storms, and now he would use that same knowledge not to build, but to dismantle. The table still echoed with her laughter, but Thomas knew it wouldn't last. Soon enough, the arrogance that filled the air tonight would choke them one by one. And when it did, they would remember this night not as her victory, but as the beginning of their undoing. The chair groaned against the hardwood as Thomas pushed it back, the sound slicing through the room sharper than any outburst could have. No words followed. No protest, no defense, no plea. Only silence, deliberate and suffocating, filling the space like smoke that refused to clear. He didn't look at Vanessa, didn't look at Michael, didn't even glance at the others, who had become spectators to his humiliation. His eyes were fixed on the table, on the plates of food, gone cold on the remnants of a meal that had turned to ash in his mouth. The quiet was not surrender. It was precision, a weapon sharper than any retort, and everyone in the room felt its weight. Vanessa shifted slightly, her smug smile faltering for the first time, just enough for Thomas to see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had wanted a reaction. A raised voice, a slammed fist, an angry declaration that she could twist into proof of his instability. Instead, she got nothing. Nothing but silence, so heavy it pressed against the walls, made the chandelier above seem dimmer, made the air harder to breathe. His refusal to play her game stripped her of the control she thought she had seized. Michael fidgeted beside her, his fingers tapping nervously against the tablecloth. He risked a glance at his father, but Thomas's face gave him nothing. The silence robbed Michael of escape, forcing him to sit in the discomfort of his own betrayal. Every second that passed without a word made his cowardice more visible, and he knew it. His eyes dropped again, but this time there was no safety in looking away. The silence followed him there, unrelenting. The others tried to fill the void, forcing conversation about nothing wine-weather business, but their words clattered uselessly hollow and desperate. Every attempt at sound only made the quiet from Thomas more powerful, more commanding. It was no longer just absence of speech. It was presence. It was judgment. It was the quiet roar of a man who had carried burdens heavier than this moment, and had chosen not to break. Thomas leaned back slightly, folding his hands in his lap. His breathing even. His stillness became a mirror reflecting their guilt, their arrogance, their complicity. Vanessa raised her glass again, but her laughter rang thinner now, strained as though she needed to prove to herself she still held the room. The clink of crystal against her teeth betrayed the tremor in her hand. The silence had shaken her, though she'd never admit it aloud. Inside, Thomas felt the fire steady into something colder. He realized he no longer needed to defend himself with words. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment of betrayal spoke more about them than it did about him. His silence was not weakness, it was strategy. It gave them the rope, and he knew they would hang themselves with it. The ticking of the clock in the hall grew louder each second, a hammer on the anvil of his restraint. He let it mark the rhythm of his resolve. He would not erupt. He would not give them the scene they wanted. Instead, he let the quiet thicken, let it crawl under their skin until they shifted in their seats, unable to bear it. He was no longer the man under attack. He was the one holding the blade, invisible, but undeniable. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Don't take it so hard, Thomas. We only want what's best." But her tone cracked at the edges, betraying the strain. The silence had forced her hand. She had wanted him to crumble, but now she was the one scrambling to fill the void. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't even blink. His refusal was absolute, and in that refusal he reclaimed the authority she had tried to strip away. Michael cleared his throat, his voice small in an attempt to bridge the chasm. "Dad," he began, but the word died before it reached full breath. The silence swallowed it whole. Thomas turned his head just enough for his son to see the calm steel in his eyes. No anger, no plea, only the weight of a father's disappointment, heavier than any shouted condemnation. Michael flinched, his shoulders folding inward, and for the first time that night, guilt visibly cracked through his composure. The silence stretched on unbearable until the meal itself became unrecognizable. The once inviting dishes now sat as symbols of decay, untouched and unwanted. The room no longer smelled of food, but of unease, of something rotting beneath the surface. The chandelier flickered shadows jumping across the walls, and the scene felt less like a dinner and more like a trial. Thomas, the silent judge, sat at the center, and though he spoke no verdict, everyone at that table knew it was already sealed. When he finally moved, it was slow, deliberate. He placed his napkin on the table, folded neatly, a gesture of finality. He pushed the chair back a little farther and rose to his feet. The room followed him with their eyes, waiting for words that never came. The silence trailed him as he stepped away, heavier now, final, unyielding. And though he left the table without a sound, his silence screamed louder than any outburst could have. It promised something they could not see, something waiting beyond this night, something far more dangerous than rage. Thomas rose from the table, his chair scraping back with a long, low groan that cut through the shallow murmur of voices. No one stopped him. No hand reached out. No voice called his name. He felt the absence of their response like a second insult, sharper and colder than the first. Each step away from the table carried more than just the weight of his body. It carried the collapse of years of fatherhood itself, as if the ground he had built for them stone by stone was dissolving beneath his feet. He was leaving a meal, but it felt like leaving an entire lifetime behind. The room didn't follow him. It didn't even falter. Forks clinked faintly against plates. Vanessa's laugh, forced but triumphant, picked up again. Michael shifted in his seat but never lifted his eyes, as though ignoring his father might erase the shame spreading across his face. Thomas paused at the edge of the room just long enough to feel the truth settle into his chest like lead. He was invisible to them now. Not a man, not a father, not even an elder to be respected. Just a shadow they tolerated until they could push him out completely. The air in the hallway felt colder, sharper as he stepped out. The light from the chandelier no longer touched him, and in that dimness, the loneliness struck hard. It wasn't the solitude of a widower, the quiet nights spent staring at an empty chair where Caroline used to sit. This was different. This was the hollow ache of being erased while still present, of being written out of the story in front of the very people he had once believed were his legacy. His chest tightened, his breath shallow, the ache curling around his ribs like iron bands. He made his way to the front of the house, his footsteps echoing across the polished wood floor. The walls lined with family photos seemed to mock him. Smiling faces stared back, birthdays, graduations, holidays. In every frame, Thomas stood tall, proud, the center of a family that had once leaned on him. Now those images were relics of a lie, reminders of how quickly love could be rewritten, loyalty erased. He paused before one photo in particular, Michael at 12 years old holding a baseball bat, his arms slung around his father's shoulder, both of them grinning like champions. Thomas's throat tightened. That boy no longer existed. That bond had died at the table tonight. The loneliness clawed deeper, not just sorrow, but humiliation braided into it. He had given them everything, his sweat, his health, his years, and in return he was cast aside, left to walk away alone. Each step toward the door felt heavier, as if the house itself was pushing him out, rejecting him, stripping him of his place. He realized with cruel clarity that he hadn't simply been dismissed from dinner. He had been dismissed from his role, from his very identity as a father. The title had been stripped silently, without ceremony, without protest, as though it had never belonged to him at all. He reached for his coat hanging on the rack by the door. His fingers lingered on the fabric, the familiar weight, a small anchor in a sea of betrayal. He slipped it on slowly, each movement deliberate, refusing to rush, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching him flee. The silence stretched around him, but unlike the silence he had wielded at the table, this one was suffused with absence. Behind him, laughter and conversation resumed as if he had never been there, as if his departure was nothing more than a chair being vacated, a space cleared for air. The front door loomed, its brass handle catching the dim light. He hesitated only a second, long enough to let the finality of the moment settle. He wasn't just stepping outside into the night. He was stepping into exile, cast out from a place he had built with his own hands, from a family that bore his name, but no longer his heart. The ache pressed deeper, twisting, but beneath it a resolve began to harden. He opened the door, and the cool night air rushed in sharp and bracing against his skin. The world outside was dark, quiet, but it felt more honest than the poisoned warmth he had left behind. He stepped out, pulling the door shut gently behind him, the latch clicking with a sound that carried more weight than thunder. It was the sound of severance. The porch stretched before him, the garden bathed in shadow, the street lamp at the corner casting a lonely pool of light. He stood still for a moment, staring out into the emptiness, and let the loneliness wash over him completely. His heart felt crushed, not just by what had been done, but by the finality of it. He was no longer the father at the head of the table. He was an outsider, unwelcome in his own story. The night pressed close, heavy with silence, but Thomas did not crumble. The ache in his chest remained raw and merciless, yet within it a different pulse began to beat, cold, steady, deliberate. They had left him alone. They had stripped him of his place. But in doing so, they had given him something else, freedom. Freedom to act without their expectations. Freedom to strike without warning, freedom to become the storm they would never see coming. He stepped off the porch, his shoes crunching softly against the gravel, each stride carrying him further from the hollow laughter inside. His loneliness was real, but so was his resolve. They had taken his seat at the table. They had stolen his role. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't yet imagine, was that Thomas still had power left to wield, and when he used it, it would change everything. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as Thomas moved farther from the house, each step carrying the residue of humiliation, yet layering it with something harder, sharper. The ache in his chest did not fade, but it changed shape. The sting of betrayal began to calcify into resolve, the helpless loneliness giving way to a quiet, simmering fire. He paused at the edge of the driveway, the night stretching out before him in silence, and in that stillness he made a vow. He would not let this night vanish into memory as just another wound. No, this night would mark a beginning. What they had taken from him in dignity, he would reclaim tenfold in power. He lifted his eyes to the sky, where a thin slice of moon glowed faintly between drifting clouds. Caroline would have called it a fragile light, but to Thomas it was a reminder that even the smallest flame can split the darkness. He imagined her voice, firm and unyielding, urging him not to bow. She would not have let Vanessa sit smug at her table, would not have let Michael shrink into silence. And though she was gone, He could almost feel her hand at his back pushing him forward. The pain of missing her fused with the fury already burning in his veins, and together they created something unbreakable. His jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides. He thought of the way Vanessa's eyes had glittered with victory, the way Michael had lowered his head in submission. That image replayed in his mind like a scar etched on stone, and each time it struck, his resolve deepened. He would not raise his voice. He would not plead for their respect. He would make them see him not through anger, but through consequence. Thomas had spent his life in construction, in blueprints and foundations, in knowing where to reinforce and where to dismantle. He understood patience, the art of letting time do half the work. He knew that even the strongest structure could collapse if one critical piece was removed. Tonight they had mistaken his silence for defeat, but it was only the gathering of precision. They had given him the blueprint of their arrogance, and he would use it. He began walking again, the night air cooling the heat on his face, steadying his thoughts. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of intention. He thought of every late shift he had worked to pay the mortgage, every moment he had sacrificed to ensure Michael's future, every ounce of himself poured into a family that had abandoned him. Those sacrifices would not rot in silence. They would become the fuel of his retribution. At the end of the street he paused beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp. The hum of electricity filled the air, faint but constant, and it reminded him of the tension humming in his veins. He stood there breathing deeply, the vow settling deeper into his bones. They would regret tonight. Not in a single outburst or petty retaliation, but in the slow, inexorable weight of justice delivered with precision. The loneliness that had once crushed him now became an ally. Alone he had no one to protect, no one to appease. Alone he was free to plan, free to strike without hesitation. They had taken away his place at the table, but in doing so, they had freed him from the restraints of their approval. He was no longer bound by the fragile hope that Michael would return to him, that respect might be given freely. Respect would be taken back, carved from their arrogance like stone from the quarry. He turned toward home, the small house he had kept since Caroline's passing, a place they had dismissed as modest, outdated, unworthy compared to their ambitions. But it was his. Every nail, every beam, every memory etched into its walls belonged to him, and from within those walls he would begin, not with noise but with calculation, not with rage but with resolve. The night stretched ahead, vast and indifferent, but Thomas no longer felt crushed beneath its weight. His steps grew steadier, his shoulders squaring, his breath evening into a rhythm that matched the certainty rising within him. They thought they had stripped him of power, but they had only handed him the clarity to see what had to be done. By the time he reached his door, unlocked it, and stepped inside, the decision was sealed. The air of the house felt different, cooler, sharper, filled with the pulse of purpose. He set his coat on the rack, laid his keys on the counter, and stood in the darkened hallway for a long moment listening to the silence. But unlike the suffocating quiet at the table, this silence belonged to him. It was not emptiness, it was preparation. He walked into the living room where Caroline's photograph still rested on the mantel, her smile frozen in time. He looked at it, his face hard, but not bitter, and spoke aloud, though his voice was low. "They think I'm finished," he said, "but they've made their last mistake." The vow reverberated through him, anchoring him, transforming the ache of humiliation into the steel of determination. They had left him with nothing to lose, and that made him dangerous. Tonight's betrayal would not fade into memory. It would ignite the storm they could not yet see coming. And as he lowered himself into his chair, the weight of decision, heavy but liberating Thomas, knew the path was set. Their arrogance had lit the fire. His resolve would carry it forward. And when the reckoning came, it would not be loud, it would be inevitable. When Thomas closed the front door behind him, the house swallowed the sound and offered him something it had not that night at the table, a quiet permission to think. He stood in the dim hall with the keys cool in his palm, The photograph of Caroline on the mantel catching the moonlight and throwing it back like a promise. Revenge was not a word he would have used at dawn, but now it settled on him like a glove. It was not the boiling public fury people imagined when they pictured a man getting back at others. It was a cold arithmetic. It was leveraged timing knowledge and the patient stacking of small deliberate moves until the whole thing tilted. The thought of teaching them a lesson gleamed like a tool in his mind, useful and precise. He padded to the study, a narrow room lined with shelves, where old bills and even older receipts lived in cardboard shoeboxes. For years that order had been background noise, the paper trail of a life spent building and maintaining. Now it became a map. Thomas pulled open a drawer and let his fingers sift through envelopes until they found what he wanted. Deeds, mortgage papers, the faded title to the second property he had quietly kept in his name after selling the family cabin years ago. He had kept that title for practical reasons, a refuge, an investment, a piece of autonomy he never announced. It had been a small rebellion, then a quiet promise to himself that part of his life would always belong to him. Tonight that promise looked like ammunition. He spread the documents across the desk and let the lamplight cast long, steady shadows. The numbers on the mortgage statements, the exact dates, the name of the lending company, each figure was a lever. The more he examined them, the more possibilities opened. There were accounts that were nominally joint but rarely touched. There was the insurance policy Carolyn had insisted on, a small thing when they were young but built up with decades of premiums. There were forgotten stocks purchased in a boom year, now bearing dividends he had never bothered to claim because he had no need then. Thomas had always been meticulous. He had kept every contract, every warranty, every unchecked box labeled in case of that men like him accumulate by habit. Those sterile papers, once comforting in their proof of responsibility, now hinted at a path forward. He thought of Vanessa's smirk and Michael's downcast eyes, and let each memory anchor a small, specific plan. He would not humiliate them in the way they had humiliated him. He would not throw a tantrum or issue grand pronouncements. He would use the tools he had: legal leverage, timing, and the knowledge that pride has a cost. There were ways to disrupt the illusion Vanessa had built without a single public spectacle. Call the mortgage servicer with correct but awkward questions. Reveal the hidden claim on property at the time of their lease renewal. Quietly transfer assets, have a lawyer prepare documents that, when folded into the right moment, would force uncomfortable accounting. He could, if he chose, unspool the threads of their comfort in small increments until the fabric of their life frayed. He opened his laptop and pulled up folders he rarely visited. Old emails, scanned copies of contracts, the name of an attorney he'd once helped at a construction job who owed him a favor, a bank officer who liked a man who kept his word. Those names were not magic, but they were the gears of a machine. Thomas began compiling contacts, the rhythm of his fingers over the keyboard, steady, almost ritual. Each email he drafted was careful, formal, not a threat, but an invitation to act. He wrote as if he were setting a watch, each sentence a tick that would bind to the next until the alarm went off in their lives. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A few porch lights burned like sentries. Inside, the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the pipes sounded familiar in the way that painful things can feel familiar. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black, and took it into the living room where the old armchair still wore the imprint of decades. He sat and let the heat settle his hands. The anger receded into something more useful, a clarity that made options into a list. Confrontation was cheap and visible. Patience was surgical. Thomas preferred the latter. He remembered Caroline teaching him to be methodical, how she had insisted they keep precise ledgers when money was tight, how she had taught him that pride without plan was a fool's currency. He could see her now in the edge of his memory, disapproving of a spectacle. He would do this her way, the quiet way, with dignity retained and consequences exacted. First, gather corroboration. Mortgage statements alone wouldn't compel action. They needed to be paired with facts that could not be shrugged away. Bank transfers time-stamped, a paper trail of payments, perhaps a notarized letter that could be presented at the right moment. Second, create small disruptions that looked incidental to others, but forced uncomfortable truths to the surface. A phone call from a title company requesting clarification, a formal notice sent to a landlord, an application for a release of funds tied to an account no one expected him to touch. Each move would be simple, lawful, and devastating in its inevitability. He pictured the scene where it would all begin not in melodrama, but in the ordinary cadence of life. Maybe Vanessa would get a letter that seemed administrative but would trigger financial scrutiny. Maybe Michael would be handed a document at a time when money was already tight. Maybe a second property would be revealed during a lease renewal like a ghost stepping into the room. The humiliation of that night at the table would be returned in a way they could not preen away from or rewrite as a misunderstanding. It would be the slow unpeeling of a lie, the steady exposure of dependency disguised as independence. His planning was not only about assets. People were part of the architecture. Thomas thought of the neighbors who had always respected him, the contractor who had once relied on his hands, the women at the sewing guild who still plagued the memory of his late wife with fondness. He could call them not to conspire, but to build a network of credibility. Their voices would matter should any denial arise. A neighbor's casual confirmation that certain payments had passed through his account years ago would carry weight. An old contractor's testimony that he had maintained ownership of the cabin would not be dramatic, but it would be irrefutable. These small human facts would stitch the financial proof into a narrative hard to dismiss. He set a timeline mentally, not a rigid schedule, but a sequence. Gather documents, make discreet inquiries, prepare the legal groundwork. Then, when the time was right, move. He imagined Vanessa's arrogance dissolving not in a single blow, but in the patient collapse of certainty. The day after that, Michael's silence would look like weakness exposed rather than a private failing. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Thomas would stand unshaken, a man who had offered his family every chance to redeem itself, and who now, with a quiet finality, reclaimed what they had taken. Night deepened, and Thomas's lamp burned on. He arranged the papers, mailed copies to a safety deposit box, and marked dates on his calendar with a pencil. He did not write revenge in florid script. He wrote logistics. He felt no glee in the mechanics, only a grim satisfaction. This was craftsmanship, honed not in a shop, but inside a life of responsibility. When he finally turned off the lamp, the house felt different. It was no longer simply a place where humiliation had been served. It was a workshop of plans, a place from which a precise retaliation would be launched. He went to bed with the map of his plan folded in his mind like an old blueprint. The vow he had made at the curb had not been a blare of rage, but a quiet pact with himself. He would dismantle the presumption that he was powerless. He would use what he had kept and what he had learned to reclaim respect without spectacle. In the morning he would begin the small acts that would in time bring a reckoning. For now the house slept, and somewhere beneath the ordinary hush, something irreversible was being put into motion. The first spark of the plan had been lit, and it would not die until it had consumed the shelter of lies they had built around themselves. Thomas lay in the dark, the house silent around him, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of settling wood. Sleep would not come, but that no longer mattered. His mind was too sharp, his blood too steady, carrying the hum of a man who had crossed the threshold from pain into purpose. The papers spread across his desk were more than records now. They were weapons. Each figure, each signature, each forgotten detail of a transaction was a blade he could wield when the time was right. The humiliation of the dinner table still clung to him, but instead of crushing him, it had been distilled into something far more dangerous: conviction. He thought again of that moment, the final seconds before he had left the table. Vanessa had laughed. Michael had sat silent. The others had turned away. He had placed his napkin neatly on the wood, his hands steady, and when he rose, no one moved to stop him. The loneliness of that walk away had been brutal. But in the very last step he had felt it, that faint upward curve of his mouth, not of joy, not of mockery, but of certainty. The smile was his secret, the first sign that he had already begun to turn their cruelty into fuel. It was not the smile of defeat. It was the smile of a man who knew justice was not gone, only delayed. He rose from bed and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back. The neighborhood slept under the pale wash of moonlight. He watched the stillness of the street, the quiet rows of houses, the faint flicker of a porch light at the corner. Somewhere out there, Michael and Vanessa were settling into their illusions of victory, unaware that the foundation beneath them had already begun to crack. Thomas let the thought settle in his chest like iron. They believed the night had ended with his humiliation, but in truth, it had ended with his promise. The promise was not revenge for the sake of vengeance. It was balance. It was restoring the order they had mocked, reminding them that respect is not a gift that can be revoked without cost. His plan would not roar. It would whisper. It would unspool slowly, each step inevitable, until the night they realized the ground had vanished beneath them. And when that moment came, the memory of his silence, his smile would return to them with the weight of prophecy. He turned back to the living room where Caroline's photograph still held its place of honor. Her face, frozen in time, gave him strength. She had always believed in fairness, had always urged him to fight not with rage but with resolve. "Never let them take your dignity," she used to say. Tonight he had nearly lost it, nearly surrendered it to fury, but instead he had chosen stillness. That choice now felt like a bridge to her, as if she had been standing behind him at that table, guiding his hand as he pushed the chair back, shaping his lips into that quiet smile. The coffee pot clicked as he switched it on, the smell filling the kitchen, grounding him. He poured a cup and carried it to the table. Not the grand dining table that had become his battlefield, but the small oak table in his kitchen, scarred with years of use. Here he had shared breakfasts with Caroline, homework sessions with Michael, quiet evenings with friends. This table still carried honesty. He set the cup down, and spread the documents out again. The lamp lit the pages, their shadows stretching long like the reach of what was to come. He traced a finger down the title deed, the mortgage statement, the insurance records. Each line reminded him that power wasn't gone. It had only been sleeping in the drawers of his study, waiting for him to claim it. He smiled again, faint but real. They thought he was finished, that his silence meant surrender. They were wrong. His silence meant strategy. His smile meant warning. The night wore on the sky outside, fading from black to deep blue. Thomas worked without haste, without distraction, his movements deliberate like a craftsman, shaping something that required precision. The plan no longer felt abstract. It was becoming a structure, brick by brick, stronger than the one he had built for them years ago. Only this time the foundation was not sacrifice. It was justice. By the time the first birds began to stir, Thomas leaned back in his chair, the documents neatly stacked, the coffee long gone. His body ached. His heart was still heavy, but beneath it all lay a steadiness he had not felt in years. The humiliation of that night had not destroyed him. It had reforged him. He thought again of the table, of Vanessa's arrogance, of Michael's silence, and he knew with unshakable certainty they had underestimated him. He stood stretched and glanced once more at Caroline's photo. "They'll see," he murmured, his voice low but unwavering. "They'll all see." The dawn broke, spilling light across the room. It caught the edges of the papers glinting like steel. Thomas gathered them up, slipped them into a folder, and set it on the counter by the door. It was not yet time to act, but when the moment came, he would be ready. That faint smile returned to his lips, the same one he had carried when he walked away from the table. It was not a smile of peace. It was the promise of reckoning. And soon that promise would be kept. Life has a way of testing dignity in the quietest yet most painful moments. Thomas's story is not just about betrayal at a dinner table. It is a reminder that respect is not something to be begged for, but something to be upheld, even when others try to strip it away. Too often, parents give everything to their children, expecting gratitude and loyalty in return, only to find silence or indifference when they need it most. But the deeper lesson is this: your worth is not measured by how others treat you. True strength lies in knowing when to hold your silence, when to gather your resolve, and when to reclaim the respect that should never have been questioned in the first place. For older adults, it is a call to remember that years of sacrifice are not erased by one cruel moment. They are the foundation of wisdom and resilience, and those who forget it will eventually learn. If this story speaks to you, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful life lessons and stories that remind us all of the dignity we deserve.